Even though elves and dwarves were immune to disease, in the middle of the Third Age there was great loss of life in the realms of men due to the Great Plague. Coming up in this video, we are going to learn about the invisible killer in Tolkien's Middle-earth. Hey, how is it going? This is Gone with Gandalf. I like to answer questions from J.R.R. Tolkien's Middle-earth. I hope you're doing well wherever you are in the real world. Now let's get into the video. So, in the middle of the Third Age of Middle-earth, there was a subsidence in the war in the north between Angmar and the languishing Arthedain. And then in Gondor, there was the ongoing rebuilding process following the civil war named the Kinstrife of the 15th century, which concluded with the defection of much of the Gondorian navy to Umbar, and where many of the men and soldiers of Númenórean descent had perished. So the kingdom was already past its imperial peak at this point in terms of influence and territory. So then in 1635 the plague came as a dark wind from the east, allegedly. It was said that this coincided with the extension of the Shadow of Dread from Dol Guldur, where Sauron had been regaining his strength for the past 600 years in secret. So it came to Rhûn first, the land of the Easterlings, prior to reaching Rhovanion, where the ancestors of the Rohirrim dwelt, where so many as 50% of the inhabitants died. Before long, in 1636, then the plague had reached Gondor and devastated the populations of the cities around the Anduin of Minas Anor, Minas Ithil, and particularly the capital Osgiliath, which was said to have been the worst affected area outside of Rhovanion. The plague, however, would continue westwards through Calenarthon and through the lands of Enedwaith into Arnor in the north. Now, the lands of Enedwaith proved not to sustain too many losses due to their self-isolation and sparse population to begin with. However, as the plague travelled northwards to the lands of Cardolan and the Shire, it would pick up again and many more would perish. And the last of the Dunedain at, this is quite a mouthful, I think this is how you say it, Turin Gorthad, would sadly die. The northern kingdom of Arthedain, though, was so far north that the plague dwindled in strength and left Fornost unaffected by it. So, how many died? No exact figure is given, but it is estimated in the hundreds of thousands. But if you consider the death toll in Europe from the Black Death, then which was many millions, well, you can't particularly count this on the same scale, but perhaps it would reach rather into a million rather than just hundreds of thousands. Now, the consequences and aftermath were significant after the plague had dissipated in 1637. Gondor in particular, was severely hampered by the depopulation, which would be followed by a quiet 2 centuries where she would have to recover. Whilst this put her in a very vulnerable and weakened state, the plague also was quite handy in that it wiped out much of the populations of the evil men of Rhûn, Cand, Harad, and supposedly affected the rebel corsairs of Umbar too, such that there was relative peace since everyone was affected equally. The lands of Calenarthon would then become largely abandoned by Gondor in all but name, and is what allowed Stuart Cirion to gift the Aertheod the lands later known as Rohan, but joining them in alliance forevermore about 1,000 years later. Now, Isengard had also been garrisoned as the western outpost of Gondor, and it guarded the fords of the Isen. However, the garrison was abandoned and the Orthanc was locked, and the keys kept in Minas Anor, later known as Minas Tirith, and would be so until Saruman was tasked as its caretaker in the 28th century. Now, Osgiliath had been the capital and was once the jewel of Gondor, but the people fled to dwell in the more open lands of Ithilien and Anorin. Since the city had been ruined by war in very recent history, as I was speaking about the Civil War in the beginning, it had already lost much of its glory, and the seat of the king would then be moved to Minas Anor in 1640, and would be then made the capital also. Perhaps more detrimental to everyone was that Gondor had long guarded Mordor to stop Sauron's return to the land, and had built strong fortresses. Such as Durthang and Cirith Ungol, and had added to the existing Black Gate also. These were then abandoned since the manpower was needed elsewhere, which would allow the return of the Nazgul and orcs to inhabit Mordor, and they would then use these fortresses for their own devious devilry. And further north there was the city of Tharbad, which straddled the Grey Flood River. I think it's Mithethel, never mind, and is the crossing point for the Great North-South Road that's connected Arnor and Gondor. The city was garrisoned by a joint force from each kingdom. However, the city was also abandoned, and would by the end of the age be in ruin, to the point where Boromir, when he was in search of Rivendell for the Council of Elrond, he lost his horse crossing the ford as the bridge had crumbled in some floods, I believe, about 100 years before. As the last Dunedain of Cardolan perished in their capital of... I'm going to try and say it again. Durngorthad, the Witch King sent in the Whites to inhabit the Barrows, which prevented Arthedain from recolonizing the area, and is where Frodo and the hobbits would find themselves trapped and then subsequently rescued by Tom Bombadil, and these would become the Barrow Downs, which people generally want to avoid. And all this happened as part of the greater plan by Sauron to weaken the Free Peoples prior to his inevitable return. Now, if you want to learn more about destructive rivers, perhaps then why not watch my video on the flood caused by Elrond to drown the Nazgul as they attempted to chase down Frodo Baggins. Otherwise, consider subscribing if you enjoyed. Now, I am going with Gandalf. Good day.